I'll tell you there's only one truth, but there's thousands of ways that you can reach that truth. But eventually you get to the point that all of them converge to the same answer, and that is the way reality is. I was working on my PhD. I realized my mind had access to information that was unknown. That changed my whole life. Suddenly, there was this whole bigger piece of reality, had nothing to do with the physical world. It was another whole set of reality that had to do with consciousness. As a scientist, I wanted to know, how did it work? At first, up until just a year and a half ago, I would have told you that I had a reality model, not necessarily the model. But after years and years and years, I realized that there wasn't any other answer. And the big breakthrough was that, what's the meaning of life? To become love, to grow. That's why you're here. So if you change the gears on life, your life gets better and better, because now you're in this virtual reality leveling up, and you'll find that you end up happy.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the KnowThyself podcast. Our guest today is a former nuclear physicist who founded my big theory of everything. His big theory of everything is his theory that unifies philosophy, physics, and metaphysics, and it has immense implications on the meaning of life and how one might navigate their own life. As a reminder, as always, we have timestamps in the description that will kind of walk us through exploring the theory to the different applications and implications around how one might live life most effectively. But I encourage you to kind of go through this chronologically, as we're going to start by building the foundation of his theory and then going deeper and higher from there. Thomas Campbell, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
You've been quite highly requested to come on this show, and it's a pleasure to have you here now in the physical. So thank you for making the trek out.
Well, thank you for your listeners wanting me to come talk to them. That's good. It's always nice to talk to a friendly audience.
Yeah. I think, for everybody that's tuning in, not everyone's super familiar with your theory. And I think it would be important just to start very baseline by asking, what is a theory of everything? And then maybe you can share why you felt compelled to create your own.
Well, a theory of everything is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a theory that explains everything. When I say explain, I mean it explains it as science would explain it. It gives a logical understanding of how everything works, why it works that way, and what are the interfaces? What are all the logical conclusions of the basic theory? And it will create a better physics. It explains things like quantum physics. Why should the reality be probability at the base, which is what quantum physics says? You get down to the small particles and you don't find mass. You don't find little tiny pieces of mass at all. Matter of fact, the physicists say at a CERN kind of atom smasher, they'll tell you that if they assumed that a particle like an electron was a little piece of mass with a charge, they wouldn't get the right answers. That's not what it is. They would tell you that the electron is a point with the attributes of charge and the attributes of mass. That is how you would describe an electron in a computer program. And that is what the reality is. It really is a computer program. So the physicists now have come to the realization that reality is information-based. And they've come to that conclusion, a decade, 2 decades ago, for many of them. Now, that's not all physicists. That's the ones that are on the edge of quantum physics, really. The particle physicists and the quantum theorists, mostly. So if you dig down deep into our reality, you find information. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you say they have information, that means that it's computable, that reality is computable. An information system can create whatever information. It's a very general information system, can create any kind of information. So that means our reality is computable. If it's computable, then that means it can be rendered in a computer. And if you think about it, how else could it be rendered? There aren't any other contenders. It's not like, well, it could be rendered in a computer, and there's nothing else there. So it leaves us with basically a virtual reality, that this reality that we call the physical universe is really a virtual reality, computed. Now, that's a real hard thing to wrap your mind around, and most people hearing that will go, wow, this guy's bonkers, that's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense. But it's a big, and the time before we're done, it will have made sense. But it's a huge paradigm shift. And I would say that it's the next big paradigm shift that will occur in science, in philosophy, in theology. It affects everything. And it's not just about science. If it were just about science, like the other big paradigm shifts, we're not at the center of the universe. Well, they believed that because they didn't understand that the Earth rotated on its axis. They saw the sun and the stars all come up and then set and then come up again and set. So it looked like the Earth was at the center and everything was going around us. It had to be in the center. How else would everything go around us? But the Earth turns on its axis, so that's how everything looks like it's going around us. And then the flat Earth versus the round Earth, that was another big paradigm shift. But those two paradigm shifts really only interested science types, philosophy types. It didn't interest a guy in the street. The guy's trying to make a living and survive and get his crops in and get them out in time and so on. He doesn't really care a whole lot about whether the Earth's flat or whether it's round or whether we're at the center of the universe or we're not. But this paradigm shift will affect everyone. Matter of fact, it not only will produce a new, more general, more accurate physics, but it also produces a logical, what do we call it, a logical map, a logical understanding of the subjective world as well as the objective world. And we've never had that before. That's new. And it talks about things that are important to that farmer that needs to get the crop in, about his life, about his existence, about what his purpose is, what he should be doing. How do you level up in this game? All of those things are important. They affect your relationships. They affect who you are and how you go about life, the choices you make. So this paradigm shift is one that affects everyone and affects everyone very much, greatly.
So you speak about this theory being inclusive of not just the objective world, which the materialist reductionists would be a proponent of focusing on, but also including the subjective world. And one cannot explore the subjective world without exploring the nature of consciousness. And I think to start baseline and build our way up through your theory and its implications, one cannot do that without exploring the perspective of what consciousness is in its fundamental aspect. So walk us through that notion, and then we can go from there.
Well, the fundamental, if you will, the fundamental understanding that you need to approach this theory of everything is that consciousness is fundamental. Everything else is a derivative of consciousness. Now, that idea used to be called, the
Panpsychist?
No, that's not the word I'm thinking of. There was the idealism. It was called idealism. Idealism is an idea that what's really real is not this physical world, but something behind this physical world. And Plato had his famous, allegory of the people in the cave, and all they could see were their shadows on the wall, and they thought that those shadows were reality. They didn't understand the light behind them casting the shadows. They didn't understand the bigger picture. So they believed that they were the shadows on the wall. Well, that's idealism. There's something else out there that's more fundamental than the physical world. And of course, the Buddha said the same thing. He said this reality is maya, it's illusion. And of course, it is. So that's true as well. But once you understand consciousness, then you can derive physics from consciousness. I can derive and have derived quantum physics and relativity both, which are the two big gems of physics. I can answer the paradoxes in both of those sciences that they can't answer. There's a lot of questions there, things they know are true, but they have no idea how or why that they're true. Like, why is the speed of light a constant? Why is probability at the base of reality? These are things that they don't know. What does it mean to say that the wave, the probability wave function collapses to a particle? Physicists they say things like that, and of course it doesn't make any sense. Probability is a mathematics. How does mathematics written on a piece of paper collapse to a physical particle? That's nonsense. Of course, it doesn't happen, but it's a metaphor. And what it looks like is that happens. It looks like you have probability, and then suddenly you have a particle someplace that you measure. But it just looks like that. It isn't. There's a big difference between what is and what things look like. A very big difference. So consciousness is fundamental. And I have one assumption in my model, just one, and everything else is derived from that logically. And that assumption is that consciousness exists. That's it. That's the sum total of all of my assumptions, is that consciousness exists. And what I did was I started with the smallest piece of consciousness, like a consciousness cell, if you will, as an analogy to the life and the fauna and the people and everything that's on this planet starts with cells, right? Cells, the basic unit of life. So think of it as a reality cell or a consciousness cell. And I define consciousness as awareness with a choice. That's it. Very simple definition. It's awareness with a choice. But that definition carries a whole lot of things with it. It carries, the awareness, that kind of comes in with the assumption of consciousness. That's what consciousness is, awareness. And as a choice. So if you have a choice, that means there was before the choice and after the choice. So time comes in as logically necessary. If you're making a choice, you have to make it based on something and for some purpose. So you get input, and now we get input through our five senses. And then we process that input, and we compare it to what we have in memory. So now we have processing, we have memory. Then we process it a little more, and we get an output. What are we going to do about that input? What does it mean to us? What is its significance? So what do you know that has input, processing, memory, and an output? That's an information system. So I model consciousness as an information system. And I look at all of the fundamental functions of consciousness, and I give them names. I made up names because I didn't want to use the old names because they were associated with this group or that or this religion or that. And rather than start those arguments, my God's smarter than your gods, I made up my own terms. So I start with the larger consciousness system. That's the whole system.
LCS.
LCS, right. And then I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but it breaks into parts, and those are individuated units of consciousness with partition off a smaller piece, which is a free will awareness unit. So I come up with these metaphors, really. You have to look at those as metaphors. Don't look at them as like physical objects. They're not objects. They're metaphors. It's understanding. Talking about consciousness is a very abstract conversation. Our language is only good for talking about things because it developed for us to communicate about things, each other being things, bodies, things in our environment, whatever. So our language is very material focused and doesn't really have the words and concepts to talk a lot about what's not physical. But yet consciousness is not physical. Consciousness is not created in a brain. Okay, so I'm skipping a lot of steps here, but we can go back and fill them in as you want to. So if you have the very smallest piece of consciousness, it's basically an awareness that can be aware of two things, A or B, 1 or 0. It's binary. Okay, that's the smallest set of things you can be aware of. If you're only aware of one thing, then you wouldn't be able to make a choice. You wouldn't have, that wouldn't work. If there's only one thing, then you're stuck. There's nothing you can do with that. So the smallest thing with a choice is two things. Now, this awareness can be in state 1 or state 2, a 1 or a 0. So it has memory. That's part of awareness. Awareness has memory. If it doesn't have memory, then everything it's aware of is the first thing it's ever been aware of, if there's no memory. So you can't build on that. If everything you're aware of is the first thing you've ever been aware of, then you can't build anything with it. There's nothing to build. You have to build the next thing based on what you had before. So you see, just that tiny concept of awareness with a choice has all kinds of logical consequences to it. Time, free will. You have to have free will because otherwise there's no choice without free will. If it's a forced choice, then it's not a free choice. It's not really a choice. It just happens. So you have free will, you have time, before and after, and you have consciousness. And all three of those are logically necessary for each other. Okay, so now we have consciousness as an information system, and it evolves. How does a conscious system, how does an information system evolve? And I'm going through kind of key steps that we're going to get there in a hurry, and then we can flesh it out later. So if you have an information system, and if that information system has all of its bits random, then there's no information in that system by the definition of random. If all the bits in the system are random, there is no information. But if you take some of those bits and order them, make order out of those bits, so those 3 bits together, you stack one on top of the other. You make a little triangle out of them. You do something that orders them, and now you have information. And that information can be a symbol for something, could stand for something. It could be the number 4 or the letter Z. You have information. Now, what you've done is you've lowered the entropy of the system. Entropy is a measure of disorder. High entropy, lots of disorder. Low entropy, less disorder. So when you take all random bits and order some of them, you've lowered the entropy. You've created order. And from that, you can see that this little consciousness cell, if you will, that's just binary, it has memory. So it can remember that it was in a state A, and then a B, and then another B, and then an A, and an A, and a B, and an A, and it can start with its memory building patterns. And those patterns now are more order, lower entropy, and those patterns can stand for something too. And you may have this pattern and that pattern, and now you have 2 patterns. So, and then you have 4 patterns, and you can group those 4 patterns into 2 of 2. So you very quickly end up with mathematics out of, the patterns. It's kind of obvious. You just stumble into mathematics because it's about quantity. Mathematics is nothing more than the logic of quantity. And the reason math is so valuable to scientists who are studying the physical world is that the physical world is totally in terms of quantity. How much does it weigh? What volume does it have? What's it composed of? It's all about quantity. So math describes those things. It is the logic of quantity. That's what numbers are. Addition, subtraction, multiplication. All of it is just the logic of quantity. So math is really good at describing things that are based on quantity. And it's really poor at describing things that are based on quality. In the objective world, you have quantity. In the subjective world, you have quality. They're different things. So what happens in the subjective world? Math doesn't seem to apply to that. Well, it doesn't. When you have the objective world, you have an intellect that processes logic in that world. And when you are in the intuitive side that's processing the subjective side. That is just information comes in whole chunks. So our consciousness has two ways of processing information: the intellectual side, the logic, and the intuitive side. Beyond logic, you just get the information. Now, as it turns out, of course, in our culture, we really put high value on that intellect, and people earn rewards in the society based on how well they can use that intellect, how they can apply it. And our intuitive side is neglected almost entirely. Matter of fact, science will tell you that there is no such thing as an intuitive side. Intuition is all just bogus nonsense. You had that idea all along, you just didn't know. They kind of say that's not there. But this model also describes very clearly everything paranormal, why it happens, what the mechanism is, and everything paranormal happens on the intuitive side. Nothing paranormal ever happens on the intellectual side. That's where the spiritual side is also. It's over there on the intuitive side. So anyway, let me get back onto the subject here. So we have these cells of reality, let's say, of consciousness, and it is expanding its memory and expanding its patterns. And then it finds out that it can just switch between a 1 and a 0 or an A or a B back and forth, and it's just created a metronome. Oh, now there's not only time that you have because before the choice and after the choice, but now you have a thing called regular time. And now it can not only make patterns, it can make sequences and sequences of patterns and patterns of sequences, and it can get more and more complex. As it gets more complex, there's more order, it's lowering its entropy. So we come to a very basic thing in my model, and that is an information system, consciousness, evolves by lowering its entropy. And the entropy just isn't putting all the bits in a row. That's a very low order of entropy. It's the meaning, the significance of those bits. So you discover mathematics and arithmetic and addition and subtraction, and which leads to algebra, which leads to calculus, which leads to differential equations, which goes on and on. All of that then comes later. It's all, again, the logic of quantity. So all those things will develop from this one consciousness cell. Now, there's two ways to think of this, and they both go to exactly the same place, and they're equivalent entirely. One of them is the cell that just keeps growing and expanding and evolving, and everything that happens is all part of its memory. Hawkins said in his last line of his book, he said, perhaps we're all just, a flicker in the mind of God. Well, that's something like that. It's just this one thing, and we're part of that vast memory in the mind of God. But the other way is that those little consciousness cells do what biological cells did. They split. Now you've got 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then they cooperate and connect and work with each other, and eventually you end up something like us, say, that we did in biology with, 4 trillion cells all cooperating with each other. Each one of those cells is sort of like a bacterium. So our bodies are composed of trillions of bacteria, if you like, that are all cooperating with each other. So now we have the idea that consciousness is an information system. The information system evolves to states of lower entropy. Okay, now it grows and evolves and keeps evolving to lower and lower entropy. And eventually it hits a plateau, because what it needs is new possibilities to evolve into, new ways, new patterns, new sequences, new ways of looking at things. Well, it kind of hits a plateau because it's just one mind. It's one monolithic consciousness. And it can only think what it can think. So what it does is the same thing cell did. We had a lot of little one-celled creatures, and what they did is that they created something else out of itself. It took a subset out of itself. So you have this larger conscious system, monolithic, takes a subset out of itself, which means it partitions off some memory and some processing and whatever. In computer terms, we call that a virtual machine inside the mainframe. That's how thousands of people can log onto a mainframe, because each person gets a little chunk of memory, gets a chunk of processing and so on. And that's a virtual computer inside a big computer. So it partitions off a piece of itself and gives that piece of itself free will, that it can make choices as well. It has all the stuff it needs to make choices. It has processing and so on. So now it has free will. Well, when you have multiple things all with free will, they begin to diverge. They end up having different experiences, different ways of seeing things, different attitudes. So it makes thousands, tens of thousands, millions of these things, and they all have free will. Now you have arguments and discussions and challenges, and that creates another much larger set of possibilities, because the possibilities of the group are much greater than the possibilities of the monolithic thing. Okay, now we're getting closer and closer to the kind of us. So those little pieces, I call them individuated units of consciousness. They're just subsets of the larger system, and they have all the same properties of the system. They're just smaller, not as much processing, not as much memory. They're just a smaller unit. So they can evolve themselves to be as low entropy as the system itself, but they'll never be as big because they're subsets. Okay, but they can be as good. They can lower their entropy as well. So that's us. We are these individuated units of consciousness. Now, the first virtual reality that this system made, now it's a system, it's got the big consciousness still there, but a lot of subsets that have free will. The first virtual reality, and a virtual reality is basically a rule set. Everybody that joins this game has to obey by these rules. That defines a virtual reality. First virtual reality was communication protocols. How could they communicate with each other? Well, you need vocabulary and syntax and all that sort of thing. So that was the first virtual reality. Join this group and you get to communicate by these rules. You abide by those rules. And you can change the rules, but you have to have rules for the communication. But the second virtual reality was all of those individuated units of consciousness with their free will. They needed to make better choices. They needed to make choices that lowered their entropy. Okay, that's what consciousness does. It's an information system. It evolves by lowering its entropy. It's hard to lower your entropy in what I call a big chat room. All these little pieces of consciousness, they can all communicate with each other now, but they could say whatever they wanted to say. There wasn't a whole lot of traction or a whole lot of significance in that, and they grew up very slowly. So the larger consciousness system, that was the daddy of them all, the father, if you will, it decided it had to create another virtual reality, but one that had a very tight rule set, one that would define every interaction. Every interaction would be defined, and every interaction could affect every other reaction. In other words, it's a tight rule set, which is the way our universe, what we call the physical universe, is a virtual reality with a tight rule set. Everything has a certain energy, right? A certain momentum, a certain state vector. It can do things, but when it does things, let's say if it moves its energy this way, then that affects somebody over there. And that thing then responds to that. And when it responds, it changes, it interacts with people next to it and so on. So it's a very interactive space where everything requires an energy exchange of some sort. So it's very interactive. Now, it creates this virtual reality, not like we create virtual realities, we program them. This one was created by coming up with a rule set and a set of initial conditions, punching the run button, and let the initial conditions change according to the rules. And we do this in computer science labs. We've been doing that for 20 years in computer science labs, where you come up with rule set and conditions and you see where it goes. And then you play with the conditions and play with the rule set, and it goes different places. So it did that, and I call that the big digital bang. And the initial conditions were a ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure, and when the run button was hit, it expanded according to the rule set. And you've all heard the Big Bang. It expands, it creates suns and planets and so on. So that's the big digital bang, so to speak. So our reality then evolved as a simulation in a computer based on a rule set and initial conditions. Now, that rule set is what scientists are supposed to do. They dig out the rules. What are the rules in this virtual reality? Well, if I flap my arms, am I going to fly? No. Rule set doesn't support it. I get brain damage because I fell off a cliff. Maybe I no longer have memory, and maybe I drag my left foot when I walk because of that. Well, that's because the rule set says that with that damage, that would be the consequence. You see? So this virtual reality perked along until it developed entities within the virtual reality by evolution. So it evolved again, stars, suns, planets, Earth, biological cells, plants, animals, people, all got developed. Now, here's an interesting part of this. You have these entities interacting, and they evolve by lowering their entropy. Now, I'm going to associate lowering their entropy with love. There's a connection between lowering entropy and love. Take a group of people and another group of people that's identical, put them all in a separate space, and this group of people, let's say, are the love group. They all care about each other. They're all helpful. They're all interested in being part of the solution for everybody. Okay, and here's the fear group over here. They're fearful. When you're fearful, you don't trust. When you're fearful, it's all about you. You become very self-centered. You want to grab whatever you can grab and fight to keep it and so on. So you let these two groups just evolve and see where they go. Well, what do you think? Which one is the low entropy and the high entropy? It's rather obvious, isn't it? The low entropy group will optimize. They will optimize whatever resources they have for all the people involved. That's the low entropy solution. The fear group will initially, they'll just beat each other up for a while to try to get each other's stuff because it's all about them, self-centered. Then they'll realize that there's powers in numbers, and they'll group up into various groups. Now, this group can take a lot of stuff because there's 20 people in that group, and they can beat up all sorts of people with that power. So then another one gets 20 for a defense against that group, and then another one, and so on it goes. And eventually, enough time, you end up with what we have in our world, which is a fear-based world for the most part. You have a lot of groups, nation states we call them, and it's all about offense and defenses. How much can you get, and can you keep it and hold it? So you end up with that kind of a reality, and that's a very high entropy. High entropy means that you don't have optimal solutions. It means that 90% of the resources are controlled by 5% of the people. And you have hierarchy, the people on top and next levels and so on. So it turns out kind of like us. So that tells you that consciousness, this is modeled best by an information system, and consciousness evolves to lower its entropy. Consciousness evolves toward love, toward cooperation, caring, sharing. That's how consciousness evolves. That's the direction. So I said you make choices. Consciousness makes choices. Well, if it makes those choices toward becoming love, then it evolves. If it makes those choices toward becoming fearful, it de-evolves. So now you have consciousness with free will that can evolve or de-evolve based on its own free will choices. Now, we'll go back to connecting that with the virtual reality. So now this virtual reality that is just evolving ends up with monkeys and people and whales and everything in it, all those entities can be conscious. How do you get to be conscious? How do you and I end up with consciousness? It's because some piece of consciousness, the things I call the individuated units of consciousness, take a subset of themselves and log it on to an avatar. But the system had to wait until the avatars were capable of making ethical and moral choices that were between low entropy and high entropy choices. So it got to humans, and that was good. Now, did the system meddle a little bit, that process? Sure. We all do that. It was going along, and we wasn't getting any good avatars, so it probably meddled a little here and meddled a little there to make it come out the way it wanted it to. But for the most part, it just let it run. If you just let things run, then it's completely coherent. Everything, kind of like has its cause. You don't have suddenly things change. So that tells us, who are we? We're pieces of consciousness. We are logged on to a human avatar. That avatar is computed, same as the avatar in a computer game. Okay, now if you play a computer game, some kind of virtual reality computer game, there's only two things that are active there, only two things that are real. One, the computer, and two, the player. The actual game, the World of Warcraft, the elves and the barbarians or the sim characters, pardon my old view of virtual reality games, I'm not up to current times with that. My memory goes back to what my kids played, and my kids are all now 40 or approaching 40, so I go back a ways. But anyhow, you have just two things, the computer and the player, that are active, real things. The virtual reality is just computed. It's eye candy. It gives you something to look at so that you can tell what's going on in the game. If you had to look at a printout and figure it out, it would be hopeless. But they make a nice, pretty picture of what's going on and who's doing what. Then you can look at it and at a glance, kind of understand the environment you're in and what your choices are. Okay, so if you're playing that game, let's say you're an elf in some game. Well, let's say you're an elf and you're aware, or at least you think you're aware. Where would the computer be? A computer would be non-physical, because to the elf, that virtual reality is what's physical. So the computer would be non-physical. And what would the player be? Well, you think you're the player. I'm the player. I'm the elf. But the player has to talk to the computer. Elves in virtual realities can't talk to the computer. They're computed by the computer.
Connected to the larger consciousness system.
Connected to the larger, yes. So it's a piece of consciousness, has to talk. The two things that are passing data back and forth is the free will awareness unit, which is really a piece of the individual unit of consciousness. It's talking to the computer. It gets a data stream. It looks at that data and interprets it as this reality. Okay, just like you look at a million dots of light on your screen, or if you got a really good screen, maybe 2 million dots of light on your screen, and you look at all those dots, and each dot has a color, a brightness, and a position. That's it. You got 3 pieces of information for every dot. You look at all those millions of dots, and you see streams and rivers and barbarians and houses and doorknobs on the doors of those houses. And the rule set says you have to turn the doorknob before the door will open, and you abide by the rule set. So that's a very quick idea that says what we are. We're in a virtual reality. Consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is an information system, so it can take a piece of itself and configure it as a computer to be the rendering engine for this virtual reality, so that the pieces of consciousness can make choices that are meaningful and significant and carry a lot of weight. And by those choices that they make, they evolve positively toward love, or they evolve backwards. They de-evolve toward fear. So that's kind of the overall model. Now, as crazy as that sounds, I got there not because I sat down one day and thought this all up. I got there because at around, I don't know, in my really my middle 20s, myself and a fellow that worked with me, Dennis Menrick, we got with Bob Monroe.
Yeah. Tom, before we jump into that story, because I think it's actually really important to see how you arrived at this point, just as a recap, because we covered, I know, which is probably the tip of the iceberg of your theory and understanding of it all, but to help kind of me digest and everybody digest the overview of what you just gave, we started at the fact that consciousness is fundamental.
Yes.
And that because we can observe that reality is information-based, we could extrapolate that there is a larger consciousness system that has a rule set of time, space, and matter, which within we are you could say that we are individuated units of consciousness, and within this reality, the perception of evolution is to move from fear to love, and by lowering entropy, we evolve. And so when we're reflecting on who we are, what this reality is, we could pick apart many of those things. But what's interesting to me is what's in our apparent differences of ethnicity and the place we were raised in and the memory that we accumulated and the illusion of separation between Tom and Andre that feel like two separate things. What's unanimous within both of our experience is that there is an experience of awareness, that individuated unit of awareness, of consciousness that you spoke to, and how in recognizing that, we see how we are much more alike than we are different.
Yes. Matter of fact, that old saying that says we're all one is a fact. We are. We all come from the same system. We're all pieces of consciousness from one system. So we really are all individuated pieces of one thing.
And you came to this experientially first because you were a nuclear physicist who was on your path, very much so on the side of logic, how you spoke to there's two paths of knowing, intuition and logic. You are on the path very much so of the intellect, and then you got exposed to these practices via Bob Monroe and TM, and walk us through your journey of how you arrived there.
Okay. I was had a master's already, working on my PhD, and in those were the bad old days of computing where there were punch cards, and debugging software was a really hard thing to do because they didn't have debugging software and they didn't have anything other than, I'm sorry, your job didn't run. That's all the information you'd get. So I found, just after learning how to meditate, I did TM, learned how to meditate, and it was very easy for me. I picked up on it instantly. And I found that I could go into a meditation state, let the printout of my cards, my punch cards, which would be like a listing on a computer roll, and I could see that where the cards were that had a problem, that were creating errors.
It would just appear in your awareness?
It would just appear in my awareness. I mean, I'd actually see the list. I'd see most of it's black, and here'd be a red line, and I'd back up, and I'd look at it, and I'd recognize the line because I wrote all the code.
So you would gain cognition of information that was not derived through the intellect.
Exactly.
But it was still valid.
Yes. And at first when I did that, I thought, well, that's fun, but it probably doesn't work. And I went and I found that it did work. It was precise. And I started playing with it more. And it got easier and better as I went. And I could even find errors in those cards that had nothing to do with my programming. They were errors in positioning the hole that the card punch. If it's a 1/10 of a millimeter in the wrong space, it's unreadable by the computer.
And that's because both the cards or the bugs and yourself as a unit of consciousness share both in that information stream. Like that data stream you both have access to, because people, I would just love for you, and you can continue to go through your story, but how it's physically possible or non-physically possible that you could have access to something beyond the intellect.
Yes, well,
that way.
That information is in a database, and the database is required in order to render the virtual reality. In order to render this virtual reality, it needs certain information to do the rendering, and we can get into that later. How does the system know what's going to happen next? because this is not a bottom-up where the last set creates the next set. This is probability. So the system has to know how to do that. It does it with a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. So it has to know what the possibilities are, and it has to know what's the probability of each of those possibilities, and that's the data set that's available. Now, the ancient Hindus called that the Akashic records. And as far as they know, it just was there because it was there. I know why it's there, because it's necessary to run the virtual reality. For the rendering engine has to have that information, or it can't run the virtual reality. So I tapped into that. And everything is there because everything is rendered. Everything here, everything physical, including those cards and the key punch and the holes, and everything's being rendered. And the machine that reads those cards, all of that's being rendered. And it's according to the rule set. So all the information is there, and you can connect to that information with your consciousness, because that's all in consciousness. You really are a piece of consciousness, so you're part of that consciousness system, and the information is available to you. But it's not available to you through your intellect. It's available to you through your intuition. You connect to it, kind of mind to mind, if you will. You make a connection to that database, and it's like any other database. You can query it, and you get answers, and then you refine your query, and you'll get better answers and refine it again.
Have you found that's all is necessary? Like the intention, or when you say set a query?
Yeah. Yes, that's all that's necessary. That's the only intention with a consciousness. An intention of a consciousness is, as we say in physics, the motive force. It's the thing that makes things happen. It's the only active ingredient. With that intention, you can heal. With that intention, you can get data out of the database. With that intention, you can go visit a past life. With that intention, you can do pretty much anything, because you're a piece of consciousness. You have access to the data that's in consciousness. You can explore that larger consciousness system.